Welcome to Truth or Dare, Authenticity, Risk, and the Future of Fiction. My name is Michael Miller, and I'm an editor at Bookforum. And tonight's talk is a celebration of Bookforum's latest issue, our summer issue, which was released online and in print today. And just a quick aside, if you're not a subscriber, please consider becoming one. I think all the emails that pertain to this event contain a link which will get you a subscription at a reduced price. And before I get started, I just want to say thank you so much for coming to everyone who's here. It's really great to see all of you, and yeah, just thanks. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get started and introduce the panelists and turn it over to them. First is Jo Livingstone. Jo is the recipient of the 2020 Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing from the National Book Critics Circle. They are a cultures staff writer at the New Republic and have written for the New York Times, the Times Literary Supplement, and other publications. Lauren Oyler's essays and criticism appear regularly in The New Yorker, the New York Times, the London Review of Books, Harper's Magazine, and many other publications. And her debut novel, Fake Accounts, was published by Catapult this February. Ed Park is the author of Personal Days and is finishing another novel. His fiction has appeared in The New Yorker and other publications. His most recent piece for Bookforum was about Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, and he's been a book editor at Penguin Press and Little A. And Omari Weekes is an assistant professor of English and American Ethnic Studies at Willamette University. His writing has appeared in N+1, The Point, The Black Scholar, and other publications. And all these writers have contributed to Bookforum as well, and we feel honored to have them here tonight. So I'm just going to jump in and, just referring to the title of tonight's event, just see what the panelists think about the title. It's a good way to start. And I just want to ask everyone, what is a risk? Like, what is a risk to you now in this, today's literary climate? Is there? Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that. I'll keep it simple. Because I know that all of you have commented on this in different ways in terms of content, form. So I'll just open it up to everyone. And Lauren, do you want to go first? Since
Not at all, but I will. I was really afraid that you were going to say, I'm going to ask you all to comment on the title by playing a game of Truth or Dare, and that was something for which I was just not prepared at all. In terms of risk, I don't know. So I was reading through the issue, and I really liked Minna Salman Proctor's piece about this anthology called, what's it called? High Risk.
High Risk.
And it was an anthology of transgressive writing from 1991. And she's sort of going through the anthology and how she reacted to it in the 90s when she was in her early 20s, and having this kind of depressing realization that she doesn't really know what transgression looks like now, because all of the transgressive stuff that was in that anthology, which is a lot of like bodily fluids, but also sort of like punk, like post-80s consumerist, like AIDS, also responding to the AIDS crisis very seriously. Like a lot of those modes of risk-taking and transgressing have sort of been incorporated into the mainstream, and it's kind of sad. But then you know, you don't want to say it's too sad because it can't, you know, the quote unquote normalization of all sorts of things is good. So it becomes a little bit awkward because I think a lot of people in the literary world are kind of depressed by like what they or we perceive as like a lack of risky, exciting fiction, but it's unclear like what something truly transgressive would look like. And I've been trying to think about it as well. And I think probably like a lot of it is difficult to say because to me, a big problem is like publicity and the way that you publicize something. So if there were something that were truly risky, it would be really local and really low key and really not like online at all. And that's, you know, sorry, but that's like where I get most of my information about books now. So I don't, you know, I think to a certain extent it might be something that exists, but we don't know about it. Is that a terrible answer?
No, not at all. I mean, does anyone else want to jump in? I mean, I think that's really interesting because I think one of the ways I was thinking about this question was sort of based around this idea of content being risky, right? Like things, you know, saying something that's controversial. But something that's come up in my in my conversations with all of you is how things can be formally risky too. And I wonder, and I feel like that can work in a lot of different directions. I mean, I think that sometimes when I think of risky, artistically risky books, I think of books that are difficult, but I think also genre can be risky in a way. And I just want to sort of open up the conversation in that way and see if anyone has anything to comment on that. And Ed, just to go back to, you know, I remember you writing a piece a long time ago about William Gaddis, who's a writer who I think is sort of brought up as a formally difficult author. And there's a Jonathan Franzen piece, you know, Mr. Difficult, that sort of distinguished between the early Gaddis and like the Gaddis that was impossible to read. And so I wonder if that question is really relevant today to whether you've read Gaddis or not, like, which I haven't, or I've read some, but not all of it. But I mean, I just wonder if that question is relevant, today, this sort of idea of the avant-garde being
I would, yeah.
Where risk really is.
I would hope that it still is, just in terms of formal innovation. It's funny you mention Gaddis, because New York Review Books just put out JR, and you know, which I read once and it blew my mind, and I was like, I don't have to read that again. But I had like an Audible credit, and I was just kind of looking around, and there it was. Somebody read. It's like 36 hours of somebody reading JR. It's one person, and a lot of people probably know, but the book is essentially all dialogue, with very little sort of interstitial matter to kind of shift the scene a little bit. And I mean, I have to confess, I'm only like, you know, maybe an hour and a half in, but it's completely, it just made me think, I wish, I mean, just to speak to the topic of, to tonight's topic, I wish more people were doing this, like writing a 700-page book that's all in dialogue, and that's going to rewire my, you know, my thinking patterns. But maybe on a still risky but kind of more modest note, the last piece I wrote for you was on the Susanna Clarke book Piranesi, which I can't recall quite how long it's been since she wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but clearly the easiest thing for her to do, like she's this master fantasist, was to just live in that world that she built. You know, that book was also, I think, 700, you know, 600, 700 pages. But instead, you're completely in the dark in this book for, you know, it's quite a short book. It's 150 pages maybe. And, you know, I don't want to, it's one of those books where you don't want to give spoilers, but there's something I really admired about that she kind of threw away, you know, her formula, or her kind of the way, how she was known as a writer, as a fantasy writer. And even though you could argue that some of this book is fantasy, it's really completely different in most respects. And I felt like that was a kind of an exciting risk to see an established author taking.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please, please.
Great. Okay, so I loved Piranesi, Ed, and I'm really excited to read you a piece about it. I think that really one of the really interesting things about that book and its relationship to Mr. Strange and John, I can never remember whether it's like Jonathan or Mr. Strange that comes first, is, you know, after she published that book, she had like a physical kind of moment of disintegration that she couldn't come back from, right? So in a way, like, yeah, it would have been commercially non-risky for her to write like a follow-up. Like, it just wasn't possible, kind of like in a health sense. And I think that that's just, it's interesting because I think like the idea of a person taking risks to write what they want to write is really different from the idea of like formal risks in like formally experimental works. And I think it's an interesting thing to try to talk about, you know, like the author's life interfering like that in her output, because it brings in issues about like, you know, health and safety, like who's in danger when they publish what on the internet, right? And like, I think that that is something that a lot of people have found difficult or like irritating about our moment, you know, literarily, that the person ends up looming too large, right? Especially as, I mean, Lauren was saying in the kind of publicity sense. So, you know, like, how do we talk about the relationship between like who's doing the writing without getting stuck in the like representation trap or like respectability politics conversation and all of these like dead ends that like don't seem to have much to do with books, but it's just difficult to talk about. I don't know. Risk,
Yeah,
health and safety.
Yes, please, Omari.
The thing about like risk that I've been thinking about is like, how do you even evaluate what a risk is if it's like not successful, right? So like the temporality of risk seems to be something that like we think about after the risk has been taken often, especially as somebody who's like, I will never write a novel. So as the critic outside, right? That kind of thinking about like what the temporality of it is actually does for me kind of really does help to even try to like define what risk could be, right? Like for the work that I do, Black writing is always already risky, right? And so part of it is not just like what kinds of formal innovations can be risky, but also just like who writing things can be risky, right? What is the risk of just like simply writing is something that I think about a lot in my work. So that's just like my inchoate kind of response to what was also a question I was afraid you would ask.
Right. Well, Omari, let me follow up with that. You know, in your piece for the current issue, which is about Paul Beatty's Anthology of African American Humor, Hokum, you start off by saying that comedy is a risky business, which, and you do get into the specifics about that in the book. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is sort of pivot to this, you know, another word that's in the title is just authenticity. And you have a line in the piece where you say, Hokum circumvents white surveillance by exhibiting Black humor within a virtual space like the Lido, a Black world in which the comedy is draped in Black reference. And so I did want to sort of touch on that and just, you know, ask if a word like authenticity even really makes sense in this context, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it a lot actually, right? Because it's the thing about Black writing is the way in which it's constantly used as like sociology, right? Especially like Black realist writing. That's like, this is a way of like just like figuring out how Black people are, what their lives are, what their kinds of worlds are from the outside looking in a way that like part of what I was interested in with the anthology is the way in which, you know, Beatty's kind of characteristic irreverence like really shows up a lot. And it's an irreverence that is like built for people to kind of like get offended by a little bit, right? Like part of, I think, his shtick is like how do we take racism and segregation and things like these very seriously, but also like attach a particular kind of irreverence to what is ultimately absurd. Segregation is absurd, racism is absurd. It's all like can be quite comedic when you like do that kind of like top-down kind of thinking about it. So for me, like the authenticity that's like a part of this collection is really about like how do you present an authentic self without needing to like show everybody everything? How do you show an authentic self without having to explain like where the authentic parts of yourself are, right? Those who get it, right? If you know it, you know it. And I think this is part of what that collection is trying to use humor to do, is create these kinds of connections between like reader and writer, be these kinds of selections, which are somewhat off kilter in some ways, actually. Just kind of like it's for Black readers in a way that like everybody I think can like laugh at parts of it. But the level of authenticity is for those who like kind of like are a part of this world, can understand its reference without like needing to, I mean, it was 2006, so I guess Wikipedia was a thing, but like before you would need to Wikipedia things. So in that way, that's like, I think how I would want to think about authenticity in this collection, but I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I jump in.
Yeah,
So I think someone who unites both of these conversations, which is like the question of what you're supposed to do with the author and like how you're supposed to think about the author, and the question of like using humor like to sort of express authenticity or not, is Percival Everett. And there was just a good article in Post 45, maybe like a month ago, that I was just reading today by Dan Sinekin and someone else about drawing a distinction between conglomerate fiction and nonprofit fiction. And they argue, let's see, who was the other author? The other author is Edwin Rowland. And they argue basically that more than Zadie Smith's Two Paths for the Novel, which is a sort of like old school realist novel and the avant-garde novel, or the MFA versus NYC conversation, that both of those sets of choices are really subsumed in this conglomerate versus nonfiction, nonprofit question. And one of the case studies they use is Percival Everett, who has been published by Grey Wolf since he started. But I did not know the backstory of his novel Erasure, which is that basically he had written this novel Frenzy, which is like about, you know, repurposing Greek myths more or less. And he was really mad that it was shelved in Black fiction section, African-American fiction section. And so he wrote this novel Erasure. I don't know, Omari probably knows a lot more about this than I do. But in the book, the sort of like catalyst for the you know, very experimental, like formal risks that he takes is his agent saying that all the publishers say that his work is not Black enough. And the narrator too is a sort of avatar or an alter ego of Percival Everett, you could say, for various different reasons. So I think that there's not a point at the end of this, but I think that that's like another example of a risky person. And towards the end of this article, I think they sort of say, well, Paul Beatty is someone who's published by like corporate publishers, and he is someone who uses the limitations or purported limitations put on you by corporate publishers, which Percival Everett would probably say you're expected to like perform a certain kind of Blackness or perform a certain kind of identity, right? And that Paul Beatty sort of works around them. And I mean, having read only The Sellout, I would agree, but obviously it's not my area of expertise. So I was wondering if Omari in particular, if you had any thoughts on that at all.
All right. Yeah, I do. I mean,
of course you do.
I mean, part of it is really about like what, and this I think gets back to like part of what I was trying to say about risks. It's also about like there's a difference between like the kind of formal risks that writers take and then the risks that they take to get published, right? So that like it is often, unless you're like Toni Morrison or whatever, right? There's a particular way in which you can like write a Black novel that is about like, you know, I have my students write about this all the time, like not like trauma porn all the time, but like there's a particular kind of Black narrative, right? That is often that which sells the most. And I think that part of like what a Beatty or a Percival Everett like kind of author really does, and this is like part of like how I like think about these things is like, how do we use like irreverence and satire riskily to tell these stories about like pretty particularly traumatic and awful things. I always make this joke that like, so I teach African American literature, and like I don't study slavery or slave narratives or whatever, but I do teach 19th century African American literature. And like I remember like talking to my dean being like, well, I'm worried that like they're gonna think that like I think slavery is a joke. Like I just like, if I were to be super serious about it all the time, like it would like break me, right? And part of what I think is like risky with regards to like those kinds of authors is like, how do you take these things that we know are like wholly and totally traumatic or totally bad or whatever, and spin them in a way that like allows us to see them like quite differently, which is something that like the sellout does, erasure does. And like those kinds of risks can pay off sometimes, but often they kind of don't, you know.
That kind of risk is also, isn't it a kind of risk of opening yourself up to misinterpretation, and a form of misinterpretation that can be more, you know, like as a calculation, like, is that going to be more damaging long term than the advancements of my interests would be by me being more serious, right? Like, which makes me think of the question of like the way that people think that authenticity is being abused, I think, in fiction. Like, I just never forget this panel that I went to at NYU, and one of the panelists like making a joke about how like nobody's allowed to write about anything that they haven't experienced themselves anymore, that like, or you know, that like her students were so closed-minded and they think that only white people can only write about being white, like that kind of thing. And everyone in the room just like chuckling and being like, oh yeah, isn't that awful, like how terrible the world is these days. But for me, that person just seemed very like confused about what authenticity was and what it's for. Because I don't know, it just makes me think of the example of Janine Cummings in American Dirt, right? Because like American Dirt isn't bad because it's like inauthentic to the experience of Janine Cummings. Like it's bad because it's really bad, and like it being really inauthentic is like part of its badness, right? But it's but like I think that the backlash against that role of authenticity in fiction has been like a little confused, maybe. This professor seemed confused anyway at NYU, like that it was like a new law rather than like a demand from her students that like maybe books be better at certain things. But,
yeah, that's
Can I
really
chime in for?
Oh yeah,
for 1
please,
minute?
please.
Yeah, no. Listening to everyone talk, I'm just sort of reminded of you know, I wrote a novel back in the early mid 90s that kind of did the rounds, was rejected, roundly rejected by many editors, and you know, I could see the point here and there, but there was one comment. I don't think I still have those rejection letters, but one of them that only one comment kind of really stuck in my craw, which was that it was not an autobiographical novel by any means, but you know, one of the things I'm interested in is Korea and Korean stuff, for lack of a better word. And there was a lot of it in this book, but it was done in kind of I just wanted it, you know, you could think of, I don't know if Gaddis, I don't know if I'd read, I guess I'd read some Gaddis, but you know, whoever you want to think of as like the postmodern, you know, writer of the time. And I kind of wanted that sort of energy and in it. And somebody wrote that my approach to Koreanness was arch. And I guess I just, as far as I know, the editor wasn't himself, you know, he was a white man, and I just felt like that was kind of, it was an early lesson in sort of, you can't really just write what you want, perhaps. And you know, I felt like I had great freedom in writing this book, and you know, I wouldn't say it set me back, but it was it was an interesting lesson. And I think not to talk too much about my own fiction, but it's interesting that there was another novel after that that was also kind of, that one didn't even get out the gate. Like I finished it and nobody, agents wouldn't even look at it. But with Personal Days, the first novel I wrote that did get published, I think it's interesting because I saw it as me taking a risk in the sense that maybe Ishiguro took a risk with Remains of the Day by having there were no Japanese British characters in it. There are no Asian characters so defined in Personal Days. But I wonder, I'm still proud of the book, but I do wonder now, as time has passed, like, was I also afraid of, my authentic, vision for the kind of fiction I wanted to write? Was it, that's not going to fly? And I mean, kind of, Lauren brought up nonprofit versus, is it corporate publishing, or that kind of idea.
Is the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, and I haven't really thought about it much until tonight. But just listening to you guys talk, I do wonder about that. Like there was sort of a lesson to me, with my fiction writing hat on. Like, I put it another way, like I wasn't in the mindset to produce whatever the traditional Asian American novel was at the time. Like I could appreciate it, but that wasn't what I wanted to write. And that, in retrospect, I felt like with so few examples out there, it perhaps was a bit limiting in terms of chances for publication.
So you kind of avoided a risk by taking another risk.
I guess. I mean, none of it was conscious, but
right.
thinking about it now, I do wonder that. Yeah, if I kind of, I wasn't ready to write the kind of ethnic novel that I thought publishers wanted, and so I kind of went in the other direction. But.
Can I ask, having worked as an editor, do you feel like there should be an onus on editors more to be the risky one, right? Like it's sort of the novelists or the writers' like natural tendency to take risks, I think, but like the people that I think about often are the editors who are like, I just don't know how we'll sell it, or like I didn't fall in love with it, and all these sort of like euphemistic things that they say.
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on the level of power you have, and I think any editor will be like, their books he or she is sort of passionate about, but it's not going to sell. Someone tells you it's, whether it's the publisher, the marketing director, or just other people are not getting the same read on it as you are, and at a certain point, if you're the lone voice and every single nobody else sees it, then it depends on how willing you are to fight that battle. But I think it's a good question. I think maybe not having preconceptions about what the manuscript, as an editor, the manuscript that lands in your inbox, you'll get a few, you'll get a pitch from the agent, obviously, but I think you owe it to yourself to, if it's something you're passionate, you read it and you're passionate about the voice, to do your best to, get it out there.
Yeah, that's.
I have a question, if I can ask a question, Michael. And
Yeah, of course.
Do we think that there's any intrinsic difference in risk that attend different like affects in writing? Like, is it intrinsically riskier to be like, critical in like, critical the way that people think of being critical interpersonally is, right? Like being mean or whatever, or like, is it more intrinsically risky to try to be like sincere all the time? Because then you risk sliding into the language of like activism, or like genres that you're not intending to work in. Yeah, I'm just curious. I've been finally reading Sian and Guy and thinking about trying to recategorize feelings that I have that I've thought of as negative as being actually signs of irreducible and interesting problems. So I'm interested in kind of affects and its relationship to risk. What do you guys think?
Well, Jo, if I can just jump in, wasn't your review, didn't your review of Carmen Maria Machado's book touch on this a little bit? I mean, I thought that maybe I'm not hearing your question quite right, but I thought that just to bring this back to what Lauren was saying about the high risk anthology, I think that there is, what I remember about that book is that there was something incredibly raw about it and incredibly, for lack of a better word, explicit and, you know, difficult in some ways. And I thought the same thing about the Carmen Maria Machado book, but there was also something about the way that she sort of channeled this story through various genres that are well honed genres. And I don't know if that's exactly what you were just saying, but I did want to pose that as a question to you, just sort of like the way a risk can sort of take the form of something that's familiar rather than something that's radically, you know.
I think that's right. I think that she did take really extreme risks in that book, and she did it, but because it's like she skated into the cliche, right? Like skated is completely the way. I was thinking of like skating, but then I'm thinking of sailing like into the wind, I think. Not that I know that what that means in like nautical terms, but you know, she went for a style of address. Like I think a lot of it's in the second person, right? So she really risked getting lumped in with like, you know, people who don't like Maggie Nelson. I feel ambivalent about Maggie Nelson, whatever, but like the second person form of address is like too personal. It's too like personal essay-ish. It's too, I don't know, that the cliches are a barrier to like truth or authenticity in a way. And she kind of, I think that she leaned into everything about the like abuse memoir or like the haunted house idea or like thinking about abuse at all, right? By going for what seemed like the most kind of instant resonance, you know, like Victorian novels, like The Woman in White or whatever, and then like various other genres, she kind of went with what were the most obvious associations and then like pushing them far enough that she got to a really like complicated place.
Right.
It's kind of like, I felt it seemed very like redemptive of its genre to me in a way.
Right. And Lauren, yeah. I'm sorry. You want to go first?
Go ahead. I feel like we're probably going to say the same thing.
Yeah, because your review of the Tori Peters book,
yeah,
I thought had something similar to say, just about, you know, vaguely analogous to that about genre.
Yeah, and I was trying to think about like whether I consider it risky, because when I was reading the book, I was like, this is like pretty cool, you know, the things she's doing, but it's in this like chick lit frame, you know, it sort of veers between like realist bourgeois novel and like actually what I would call chick lit. And like, but the sort of underlying structure of the relationships is like really quite like risky. And then I was thinking about like, okay, it was the lead title for whatever press published it, and I'm sure it got like a pretty good amount of money. Does its getting a good amount of money sort of preclude it from being risky? And it in fact is sort of like acquiescing to whatever the standards for risk or being mainstream at the time, like sellable goods, right? Like, and is being a really sellable product, does that preclude it from being risky? I don't really know. I can't really decide. Also, like, to be clear, I've been thinking about this as well, like just because something isn't risky doesn't mean I don't like it, right? Or that it can't be good. It's just like a different kind of thing. And I think there has been, over the past few years, less so now, I think everybody's sort of done with it, but there was, Michael and I were talking about this also, a tendency to call like anything a marginalized person did like radical, and, you know, concomitantly imply that it was like taking huge risks, when in fact, like it actually wasn't. You're making like a sort of basic TV show or whatever. So
those are two different types of risk, aren't they?
Well, it's like a risk, but also if it's not a risk to you, I think you've been talking a lot about like, I'm risking my like artistic purity, or like, you know, not being true to myself. But I think there are a lot of people who like don't have those principles, or they have like radically different principles, and like it, you know, they're like, I want to make something that I like or whatever. I don't know. it depends on what your parameters are, I guess.
Right. Like, I think in the example of Tori Peters' book, like, you're right, she kind of veered away from certain risks in formal terms and in commercial terms, but by doing that took a huge like personal risk, right? No, like Rachel Cusk's new novel is kind of like about this, right? Like trying to like make great art while being a human being who's like in a community, right? Because I think like there were just hundreds of really, really nervous trans people being like, this book better be fucking good, because like it's a huge risk to take all that money. And then inevitably you'll be seen as speaking kind of like for people, right? And that's a completely different risk than the commercial prerogative, it seems to me. But a huge one, because there are so many, you know, queer critics
Well,
who
yeah,
like,
you don't, it's also like, even if the critics say bad things about you, you also like don't want people you respect to like say that you're an idiot and you are a traitor, like, you know what I mean?
oh, seriously, because
Yeah.
like, what are you gonna do? Like, there's only so many places where like trans people go to hang out in the summertime, you know, like you don't want to be unpopular
persona non grata.
book, so like then you end up, you have to, well, I think that you said something similar to this, Lauren, right? Like you take a risk which then like you can only answer or like make safe by putting in enough work to feel that you've like, that it was worth it to yourself. Does that make sense? But yeah, well, risks with different
rewards, well also it's like trade-offs, I don't know. And I think too, like the public, I don't know, receiving like a wide variety of responses to your work is really interesting, because like usually when you're writing for magazines, like a kind of person is responding to your work and you think of your like audience in a certain way. Sorry, this sounds super obnoxious, but then like you have a wider audience and like all different sorts of people like bring different things to it or whatever. And so then you can't really like think of risk in absolute terms, because something, you know, Tori Peters is a great example, because she is the rare case where like, you know, conservatives aren't reading literary fiction, but like Tori Peters has a subset of people who are really would hate her and are kind of liberal, which is to say TERFs, right? And they might actually hate it, right? Right. And so like, does she conceive of offending TERFs as a risk? And like, would I don't even know, because they're totally separate from me, and there's like a whole group of people that I don't care if they like my, you know, or, you know, I wouldn't care if they like my work or whatever, because they're also not holding the purse strings.
Right, but they do. That right. There's a question of like, safety am I willing to risk? You know, like, am I willing to inflame TERFs so that like I put people on like the street at more danger of like interpersonal attacks? You know, like that kind of risk. You're not God. You can't make those kind of calculations, and yet they're totally present. Because that's like the danger of pissing off TERFs and racists, right? Is that like someone gets hurt.
So, Omari, I might be asking the same question twice in a way, but I just wanted to comment on this essay that you wrote about the poet Courtney Lamar Charleston, and just the way that you described him navigating ideas about what Black masculinity means, both inside and outside of the Black community. And I feel like this is perhaps a good point to talk about that, just because you know, just the sort of occupying of various positions at the same time, and what does a risk look like in that context?
Yeah, so for those who like haven't read Charleston's collection and his poetry, like part of it in this last collection is about, you know, he kind of grows up as like a Black nerd within a kind of milieu in which like that's like not that acceptable. So he like puts on like particular kinds of like masks to show that he's like harder than he like actually is, because like what he would prefer to do is like read Proust or something. And part of what I think is like what he talks about with regards to risk is like stuff about like, for me and like my work, that's like the most interesting stuff is like about like intimacy, like what kinds of intimacies are available to him as like Black man, right? Which like goes back to kind of Jo's question about like what kinds of affects are risky. Like that is quite like gendered heterosexed, racialized, right? There's a question in the chat about like Ishmael Reed, and like Ishmael Reed's kind of like persona outside of his novels, especially now, is about like being like a kind of like cantankerous like guy or whatever. That's like, I don't know how much that is helping him commercially. I found his stuff on Lin-Manuel Miranda to be extremely funny. But like part of it does seem to be about like, you know, what kinds of affects are available to certain kinds of like racialized and gendered and marginalized people, right? So that like, you know, very few Black women, I think, would get away with the kind of like thing that Ishmael Reed does, right? That's like a really like cantankerous like anger about like other people just like doing shit, right? And that thing that Jo, that you were also talking about, Jo and Lauren, about like, you know, the personal versus the commercial risk, right, does feel for me like actually quite conflated, right? Because it's like you can take on particular kinds of personal risk with regards to like the art you make, right? And if those like either, you know, harm you or harm people around you, right, that does still possibly have like the possibility of like either making you not want to write anything else or like totally changing like your kind of creative style, which would be something that like an editor or publisher might not, you know, really like, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but like part of what I've just been like thinking about, especially like after that poetry collection, is like for Charleston, it feels like poetics provides this space for him to explore this kind of like childhood that was at least partially denied to him outside of his like home. And like the way in which these kinds of poems come across that allow him to kind of think about like, not like his queerness or anything, but like does talk about like, you know, like straight Black men can't like Frank Ocean or whatever, right? It's like within these kinds of like poetic worlds that he creates, just like turning to Frank Ocean provides this like moment of solace in which like he's both like not thinking about necessarily all of the friction that occurred in his childhood, but is about a future in which like, you know, that kind of availability to like intimacy and vulnerability will either be a risk that pays off or will just be like less risky.
Right. Thank you.
Like in that Frank Ocean song about unburdening yourself emotionally to a taxi driver.
Exactly, because it's like, I mean, in that poem, he's talking about like listening to Frank Ocean on a drive, and there's like stuff about like remapping the coordinates of intimacy that I would like do if I was like trying to write like an actual academic paper about it. Like redoing these coordinates and creating new affective maps and blah, blah, blah. But in like the kind of just like space of the poem, it's like, well, like these drives are like freeing, like driving around is like, and often with no actual endpoint or goal is actually quite freeing, which allows for these other kinds of intimacies to be a part of his thinking.
Yeah, thank you. I want to pose a question to Ed, and it's partly nostalgic because Ed and I used to sit next to each other, and we used to read a lot, and we'd just talk about what we were reading. And we've been talking about risks as writers, right? But all of you are, in addition to being writers, you know, really insightful readers. And I get a sense from all of your writing as critics, you have something interesting to say about how we might take more chances as readers. And maybe that's, Ed, do you have anything to say about that?
As a reader, how we can take more risks.
Yeah, like just rather be, instead of just making this all about like what are the writers doing to take chances and new territory.
I wish I had my unread copy of Duck's Newburyport next to me. Like I always like, I'm a sucker for, and I like Lucy Ellman. I read her other books, but that, you know, it's also maybe as I'm getting, Michael, I don't know if you're like this too. As I'm getting older, you know, my eyes are bigger than my stomach when it comes to reading, and you know, I have to confess, like a fair amount of in the last couple of years, like I've been reading a lot of sort of like mysteries and thrillers, almost as, you know, I want to keep that engine going. And I'm not looking down on those books. I genuinely enjoy them, but it's often, you know, I'll reach for that before like opening, you know, something Duck's Newburyport, I guess. But I guess I would also say I've always, you know, I still try to be adventurous in other ways. So I'm kind of, if I look a little frazzled, I've just, you know, the last like 3 or 4 weeks, I've been working on a piece about this just incredibly difficult Korean poet from the 30s named Yi Song, who Wave Books has just put out. And I've been reading him since like almost 20 years, and I still don't, you know, what is it about him that I've found so alluring? It keeps me coming back, and yet I was determined this time to like kind of break through to a kind of understanding about what he was all about. And so this involved, you know, basically stockpiling all the available translations I could find in English, and learning. He was part of this circle of other, even less well-known Korean modernists from the 30s, and like tracking down their stuff. And it's sort of, as much as I kind of, you know, the day would end and I still wouldn't have finished the piece, and then the morning came and I'm like, oh, I got to do this, you know, it just went on, and yet there was something so I don't know, genuinely moving about. It seems strange to say this about writing a piece, but I feel like, and maybe all of you can share this, when you kind of feel like you've gotten somewhere with a writer that you're reading, like it's just a great feeling. So I you know, I want to keep myself open to sort of difficulty in that sense, and but having kind of gone through that now, I think I need to take a break for a month or so.
And Lauren, what about you? I mean, your piece on trolls in the new issue, I feel like touches on this in a way. It just in that you sort of present a form of reading that, well, you refer to readers who are gullible romantics, and I don't know if there's an antidote to that, or if you want to comment on the risk that certain readers might take.
Well, I think it's really odd to approach a book and feel like I just like can't imagine being offended by a book like in the traditional way. Like I'm obviously like incensed by a lot of books, but like because I'm like, this book should be better, it's like absolutely scandalous how bad this book is. And I think it's like maybe because I didn't grow up reading any like serious literature, like in any sense of the word. Like no one around me was really reading any serious books. I got to, and then I went to Yale, and it was like I was an idiot. And so I always like approached books like thinking that I'm an idiot. And then so I can't imagine sort of like getting mad about Bernhard or Nabokov or like someone like this. And also I think it's hard to talk about sort of historical trolls in literature because most of them are now canonical, and we sort of appreciate their ire and their resentment and their critical approach. And like maybe it's harder to appreciate those things when they're live. I don't know. This is why this like stupid perennial, like, would we have published Lolita now? And it's like, well, they didn't publish it then either. So it's a sort of like pointless question to ask. But yeah, in terms of reading, I think if any of my haters are out there, you should go look at my Goodreads reviews, because I think I probably have the worst ratio of like stars to number of reviews that exists. And the things people say about my book are like, I don't know. I was reading all of these trolly authors, and like a lot of their interviews and their sort of essays and stuff were like responses to getting like kind of bad reviews or like incurious reviews or something. And I like really was identifying with it a lot because I was getting all these like people being like, she uses big words, but also just like all sorts of thing. Like I'm like you read it wrong. Like you didn't. You're not supposed to say like you're not supposed to respond to your negative reviews. And everyone hates their Goodreads reviews. But whenever anyone complains about their Goodreads reviews, I'm like, check your privilege. Look at mine. They're really bad. Like so, you know, I am trying to like be the bigger person here, but I can't hide my like resentment of people who approach a book as like a person talking to them rather than like something that someone has made and that has a bunch of different elements going into it, and it is a piece of art and it is like a construction rather than like I'm having a conversation with you and insulting you to your face. Do you know what I mean?
Reminds me a little bit of Atessa Moshfegh's kind of little snippet in the new supplement, right, about truth and authenticity, where she says, the risk I want people to take is to be willing to like offend people and be like, and not to like censor yourself according to the imagined judgment of like a censorious reader. And I think that's something that came across in like Christian Lorenzon's piece about irony and like thinking, you know, like that irony is dead. And the confusing thing to me about Atessa Moshfegh's statement is like, who are these people? This like this like censorious force of like public opinion, and like it exists on Goodreads, right? And exists on like
it exists everywhere. I think it exists
everywhere in society, but like where is it in literature? You know, like well, I don't think that there are serious critics who are telling people that they're like bad people for writing like unpleasant books, you know. And I think that, and also like Christian's kind of promotion of irony as like a solution for this kind of like one-to-one mistaking of the author for someone's, you know, for someone's like personal arguments or personal morality. Like it doesn't really work for me, because to me, like irony is not an intrinsically risky strategy, right? It's just a, you know, like it's not a style. Like if you're just ironical as a style, that's just like being Chandler from Friends, right? Like irony completely depends on like what the ideas are, like what you're reacting to.
Well, there are famously many different types of irony as well.
That's true. Yeah, of course.
But like, I feel like we're like basically talking about like when people are like decrying or praising irony, like we're basically talking about like disaffection and like Chapo Trap House, right? Like we're not actually talking about the many different forms of irony, which can all be used to varying effects, right?
Right. I think that's true. And right, like disaffection, detachment, like a willingness to depart from like the right, like from the literal meaning of what you're saying, right? Like as the basic function of irony, like I think it's a lot riskier to be sincere now, because like the backlash against sincerity is already in such underway so hard. Like,
but where is that? That's what I'm wondering. Like, where is that backlash to sincerity?
That is like, in like your pieces. I think it's in Christian pieces. I think it's in like a
yeah, but Jo, who am I? Like I have a backlash. I don't like it because it's like the thing that I see, and like all of the, I mean, most of the, I would agree with him that like many of the sort of like flashy contemporary fiction, and also you're reviewing like a bunch of different things. Like you're not always reviewing contemporary fiction, and it's like the big books are always, even if they're not every word for word, like I'm weeping while I'm writing this book, there is this like kind of lesson or sort of like sincere epiphany, or like we're all good people, or we're all like trying, you know, like it's this like very sort of depressingly like one-dimensional view of the world, and like I find it alienating, right? And it's like, you know, also something I've been thinking about is like this idea that there's an opposition between irony and sincerity. Like, what if I like genuinely do hate you? Or like, what if I genuinely do like have this sort of ironic disposition where I have like two things in my mind at once and they're both true? And it's like, I want to say, you know, I want to say your book sucks, but I want to like, it's also clear that I want to do it in like a fun way, right? Like that's like that there's nothing insincere about that. And this is something I was thinking about with Bernhard as well, where it was like, no, he like he seriously hates you, but he's like fun about it, right?
I guess what I don't know. I mean, I just think that like, yeah, those are, when you talk about like big books, right? Like those are commercial values.
Yeah.
And I think that like Atessa Moshfegh thinks that there's like an authority that those like commercial values are like occupying, that is like oppressing writers against writing like risky and unpleasant things, which like I don't think that exists. At least in like intellectual culture, I think like the opposite is true. You know, like in academia, like it's much more common to find someone being like, oh, isn't it tragic? I'm not allowed to write about someone that I don't look like anymore. Like that's just been my experience. But I think it's just interesting, like if you push into it, like, okay, the values of the commercial are like inherently conservative, right? Like they're gonna say that like representational is radical when it isn't, right? But like, what if we have to accept that there is like a conservative set of language that like we are represented by, right? Like a general, you know, like vision of progressive politics or whatever, and be like, okay, well, if I'm gay, I'm already going to be represented by like an ugly rainbow as flag, right? Like it doesn't mean I like the flag, but I'm going to be represented by it anyway. So like, what do I find if I like lean into the familiar that way rather than like reacting against it, is I guess what I'm.
Yeah, I think I'll just say one thing and then someone else should talk, but the commercial issue is entirely about people want the money that the sort of sentimental, like easy books are getting, right? Like it's the risk that you're taking when you're taking like a risk, to me, is like you're going to get paid $5,000 and, you know, 20 people are going to read your book or whatever. And like, we're supposed to be pure and artists or whatever. But I think anyone who's complaining about these things is at bottom, like concerned at least a bit about the sort of commercial viability of their lives, because, you know, I think a lot of writers probably don't want to teach, or they like don't really want to have a day job, or they don't, you know, and like, is that fair? I don't really know, but it's like, but there are people out there getting $2 million book deals. There are people out there getting $750,000, and it's like, I want $750,000, you know, like, and so that I think is or I want $100,000, and, you know, why I, you know, feel like I'm contributing something to culture as a not commercial writer. And it just doesn't work that way. And I think people also say like it used to be more equitable, and it used to be that there were sort of more mid-range book deals, and now there aren't. And I obviously was not around at that time, so I can't say if that's true, but like, I think that's like where the frustration comes from.
Don't you think people get mixed up with the style and the ideas, right? Like they end up reacting to like the style of like an SJW style, like expression about righteousness or justice, and then they get, you know, they can't tell the difference between that and like a genuine engagement with like a true belief in an idea.
Yeah, but I think if you're a literary writer, shouldn't you care about the style? And the style, you understand that the style sort of affects the presentation of the ideas, right?
Well, that's what's interesting, right? Like, and I wish that we could get like there, you know, and I just think that some of our fights, like it stops us from getting to that place where we can actually like talk about the stylistic issues at hand, because like the political language is just getting in the way.
Well, it's like a question of priorities. Like, are you prioritizing the style in which the idea, are you prioritizing the like ideas, and if they're sort of presented in a maudlin or whatever kind of style, is that okay? And you're like, whatever. Or are you, I'm not saying you, I'm saying is a critic like more concerned with the style? And I guess in the past, you know, there would have people being like, oh, Norman Mailer's a great writer, but he's like just like, you know, hurting, you know, physically harming people left and right, and also like not saying anything particularly interesting. So are we like overcorrecting? Like, is there a happy medium? I don't know.
Well, this might be a good point to open the conversation up to the audience. I have a couple questions here. One is from Kara Adams, and she asks, Do any of you have a sense of how other countries' literary cultures and economies might support risk? I wonder if, say, better public funding for the arts, or for people more generally through, say, healthcare and childcare, might help more risk-taking literary work exist and even thrive. Dorothy Norris, Han King, and Sheila Heti come to mind as examples of international writers who take interesting risks and who were supported as artists abroad before their work found support in America. I wonder what that might suggest.
I don't, but I can start by saying I just finished reading, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but Paula Oloishirak's Mona, which is like kind of about like the ways in which like being just like a Latin American writer presumes particular ways of like writing. That the novel, to go back to like my point before about like, you know, what is the, like, how can we think about like irreverence as risk, right? The irreverence in that novel that like I think is like quite risky, especially as like, you know, the way in which she talks about literary writing, the ways like I have a particular orientation to writing as a scholar and a critic, right? That's like, it allows for a thinking of less like how that works in the particular country that she's from, and more about like how an international kind of marketplace also like provides certain kinds of limitations upon writing. So like somebody like her who, excuse me, somebody like, I promise I've gone through puberty. Somebody like her who like, this is like her third novel, right? Part of it seems to be like the kind of commercial success that she got with the irreverence of her first two novels is dialed up in this third one because she had the success from before, right? So in that way, like for me, like I don't know anything about like, I think it's the Argentinian like literary marketplace or whatever, but like the idea that like in order for you to have any sort of like world or international renown, right, you still have to play within the kinds of parameters and just like constricting aspects of like getting published that we've been talking about.
Within your native country.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then also like internationally, that then that
right.
adds a certain layer of like other kinds of stakes, right? With regards to like how you are showcasing that country on an international stage, right?
Yeah.
How you become the avatar for like an entire country, right? Because an international marketplace suggests that there are only a few that can come outside of like the United States or the UK or whatever, right?
Like kind of national ekphrasis or something.
yeah.
I just finished reading the new Murakami collection, and I haven't read more. I used to really like Murakami, but I'd sort of, you know, I've missed the past several books, but for some reason, this new collection, First Person Singular, I just found it really enjoyable, just kind of pure enjoyment. And I think one of the knocks against him is that he's, you know, kind of, Omari, to what you're saying, like he sort of represents Japan to a lot. Like if you ask Joe Schmo on the street, literary Joe Schmo, and say, you know, name a Japanese author, it's going to be Murakami, odds are, right? So then he kind of becomes a stand-in. And then, but Murakami himself, you know, I just find it fascinating because like a lot of his influences are also coming from the West. And so he's sort of this, it's like a perfect storm or whatever in terms of like he's palatable to, you know, some American or Western audiences as well. But one thing I liked about this book, they're short stories, but they're also, you feel like almost all of them, you know, the title is maybe a giveaway, like it comes from something that happened to him, or so it seems. And in several cases, it seems clear. And in one of them, like one of my favorite stories is called The Shinagawa Monkey, and he goes to this hot spring, and there's like an actual monkey who's sort of talking to him about his life and stuff like that. And the Murakami figure is so flustered because he feels like he should write about it, but he doesn't, you know, he knows what his editor is going to talking about taking risks. He knows like his editor is going to say, you sure you don't want to write this as fiction? So the Murakami character is kind of grappling with, you know, how to almost how to market this story. And I guess the joke's on us because the story is written and we've just read it. But
I have another question from Karen Quivillon. Also, what about risks in moving from one kind of writing to another? The expectation is that an author has a certain brand or style or genre, and departure from that is considered risky for audiences. The riskiest position these days may be to not declare oneself as a particular kind of authentic voice.
Sometimes you don't get a choice, right? Like you just get thought of as authentic. And that happens to different writers to different degrees, right? Or particularly inauthentic, or and I keep thinking about Rachel Cask's new novel. I really like it, but she's such an interesting one, I think, because of her own very tense personal relationship to the detached mode of narrating something. While narrating things which are pretty close to her own life events, right? In some of her work. And that is its own tension. It's like a conversation that's now happening within her own style, and that she's moving more towards the new book is about a family, and that's kind of a place where she realizes that the detached style, it can't go, the detached style doesn't go, it doesn't match when she's talking about the experience of motherhood, right? So she has to kind of break it at some point. But that would only be possible, this far into Rachel Cusk's career, and depending on the books that she has taken, so she has already written, and how they have been taken by readers. So that's I think an interesting question.
I think Rachel Cusk is interesting, in this context as well, because she is really the sort of nexus of a problem that I see, which is that all of the sort of contemporary writers working now have to deal with a public awareness of their persona or their public personality. And they gave all these interviews because there were all these websites that were asking them to give interviews. And now you've got all of this autobiographical material about you floating around. And I see autofiction as a kind of response to that a little bit, because you're I give up, I can't pretend that I'm not doing this because I'm doing it. And Rachel Cusk had this sort of traumatic, as she characterizes it, experience when she was publishing her memoirs, where again, all the Mumsnet people were screaming about how she was a bad mom because she wrote this memoir about being a mother and having sort of ambivalent feelings about it. And yeah, it's a real problem. You also don't, I think, set out to brand yourself a certain way, but the brand, just as if you're characterizing your friend and you say they have X, Y, and Z qualities, a characterization naturally sort of attaches itself to you, even if it comes externally. But then you're I'm trapped in my persona or whatever, and I can't get out. So yeah, I think it's a problem. I totally agree with whoever asked the question.
At least when a backlash forms, the possibility of leading a backlash against yourself for profit under an anonymous name surfaces, which no one's done yet.
That's true.
I'm gonna do it.
You don't know if they've done it though.
Good point. Maybe you haven't already done it.
Well,
I was thinking of I don't know if this is I'm trying to remember the original question, but I feel at the beginning I said I'm just reading easy stuff, but I'm actually reading the newish Nicholson Baker book, which is it's called Baseless, and it's about germ warfare. And he's someone he's really had 2 or 3 careers as a writer. I mean, I kind of fell in love with his writing when he was this miniaturist with the Mezzanine, and his first several books, and his memoir You and I, kind of this very high Mandarin style literary author. And then I kind of we kind of parted ways with some of his book length nonfiction, but there's something about this book, obviously with the in the age of COVID, and now all this sort of attention on this idea of a lab leak, it's like, here's a guy who, you know, he kind of has put his fiction career on hold more or less, and is just digging deep into, you know, Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to get the stuff from, you know, the 50s and 60s, like evidence of, you know, experimenting with biowarfare. And I don't know what to make of it. Like, it's kind of a weirdly readable book, despite the grim subject matter at one, because like every so often he'll slip into his old, like kind of friendly, user-friendly mode, and you know, one of his dogs will come into the room as he's researching, and then there was a funny quote where the dog comes in, he made wheezing, moaning sounds, very human sounds, as if he wanted to tell me something autobiographical. I held my hand for a long time on his small warm head. Every dog has a novel in him. And I just thought, in the midst of this book about, you know, essentially about biowarfare, there's something, I guess I like that, even though I haven't even picked up his last few books, that he can still sort of surprise me and make it worthwhile.
Nicholson Baker is a man really, you know, like exploring his privilege. You know, like I love it. He's
sure,
like,
yeah,
I can do whatever I want, and I'm going to try and just see what happens. And like, I acknowledge that there are very few risks involved, and I'm just going to like do it, and that's why everyone loves him. You know, he's like drawing his pictures in pencil and posting them on Twitter. It's great. Which
brings me always back to my struggle as well, right? Like, what is the risk in telling a long story like that, in which what you're constantly doing is being sincere about how much of a dick you are, you know?
Right.
I struggle.
People talk about A Little Life a little bit in the chat as well, which is
yeah.
a good one.
Well, so in response, so I don't know about the commercial history of A Little Life, but I did listen to her give a couple of interviews, and she made it seem like the book was not like necessarily a hit for the publishers, and that this is all gossip, I don't know, but she made it seem like she was doing a lot of her own marketing, and like she was like doing lots of campaigns like that were quite successful, and the reason why it was successful is she like took matters into her own hands. I don't know if that's true, but Omar, were you talking about my struggle as in Canascard or your personal struggle as?
No. My struggle is not being
well,
just
another Canascard novel.
Okay.
I would say the same thing about Little Life. It's also about like queer whisper networks. I feel like when that novel came out, like all the gays were like, "Oh my god, you have to read this." It really made me cry.
And I love the question of authenticity that crops up around that book, because so many people are like, nothing this, you know, this many bad things don't like happen to people in real life. Like, of course they do. Of course they do. Like, nothing but bad shit happens to people all the time. And it's like more inauthentic that novels generally, you know, like veer towards it not being just like a tale of disaster from beginning to end, because like that's what reality is, mostly just like a pageant of suffering.
Drama.
Sorry, what? What did you say?
No, I was just saying like novels being built around the one climactic trauma as opposed to like the litany of traumas that happen to us like all the time.
Which is more realistic.
Yeah.
All right.
But only to certain readers. You know.
All right. Well, I think that that's time. And I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to the panelists. You've all been amazing. I really appreciate it, you know, helping us celebrate the launch of this new issue. And it's just been great listening to you. And I want to quickly thank, you know, my colleagues at Bookforum, Jennifer Krasinski and Dave O'Neill, Mara Smith, Lizzie Harding, Kate Koza, Danielle McConnell, and Tony Kerner, and everyone else who helped out. And thank you to the audience. Just thanks for being here. And have a great night. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
No, seriously, I'll reach out to all of you individually. But
Subscribe to Bookforum.
Thanks.
Subscribe to Bookforum.
Yeah.
All right. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.